How far would you go to settle a score? Well, for a guy like the legendary Bigfoot Wallace, the answer was simple: as far as it took, and maybe even a few steps beyond. You see, Wallace was initially drawn to Texas in order to avenge his brother's death. And then, over the course of his career as a Texas Ranger, he'd square off against everyone from Mother Nature to Comanche warriors and even Mexican soldiers. A lot of Mexican soldiers. Wallace served hard time in prison. He narrowly escaped death on multiple occasions, and at one point he was even forced to draw his own life from a jar. White beans for the living and black for the condemned. And through it all, he survived. By the time it was all said and done, Bigfoot Wallace would go down as one of the most iconic figures in all of Texas history. A man celebrated for his courage, feared for his brutality, and immortalized in a haze of tall tales. But just how true are the stories? Is Bigfoot Wallace really the hero that Texans make him out to be, or is something much darker lurking beneath the surface? How exactly did he earn the nickname Bigfoot? And is it true that he once ate 27 eggs in one sitting? Stick around and find out, including my own personal opinion about mixing politics with history. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
William Alexander Anderson Wallace was born in Lexington, Virginia on April 3rd, 1817. And aside from having a mouthful of a name, there's really not a lot known about Wallace's early life. Shocker, right? As far as I can tell, he had a fairly normal childhood, just growing up there in Virginia and working on his daddy's orchard. This would change drastically in the spring of 1836. That's when young William learned that his brother Sam, along with one of their cousins, had been killed down in Texas. A little incident known as the Goliad Massacre. If you're not familiar, that's when the Mexican general Santa Anna ordered the execution of over 400 Texans, unarmed men who had surrendered thinking that they'd receive clemency, only to then be gunned down or bayoneted in cold blood. As I'm sure you can imagine, Wallace took this personally. He also vowed to take, quote, pay out of the Mexicans. And yeah, just a few months later, at the tender age of 19, he left home looking to do just that. The only thing is, by the time Wallace arrived in Texas, the revolution was already over. So rather than exact revenge, he instead took to farming down in LaGrange, which, according to the great Charlie Robinson, is too damn hot. I guess William felt the same way, as he'd soon relocate, first to Austin and then to San Antonio. By the way, before we go any further, we do need to address Wallace's physical stature. In a day and age where the average American male was around 5'7" tall, Wallace was a towering 6'2". He was also said to have been 240 pounds worth of solid muscle. As to how exaggerated these claims are, I really can't say, but he does appear to be quite the tall drink of water if his photos are any indication. In fact, his large frame may have even contributed to his nickname. More on that in just a bit, but in 1842, Wallace would finally get a chance to avenge his brother's death. You see, the revolution may have ended way back in 1836, but old Santa Anna was still chomping at the bit to regain control of Texas. And that being the case, he ordered General Rafael Vasquez, along with a force of around 700 soldados, to occupy San Antonio, which they did on March 5th, 1842. They would withdraw just a couple of days later and head back to Mexico, but a similar invasion occurred the following September. Only this time it was twice as many soldiers under the command of Mexican General Adrian Wall, and once again they were able to capture San Antonio. In response, our very own Bigfoot Wallace joined up with Colonel Matthew Caldwell and famed Texas Ranger John Coffee Hayes. As such, he would play a very active role in the Battle of Salado Creek. Per historian Sam Haynes, quote, on September 17th, the Texans engaged Wall's troops northeast of San Antonio and repulsed several assaults by Mexican infantry at the Battle of Salado Creek. During the course of the fighting, a company of 53 Fayette County militiamen, under the command of Captain Nicholas Mosby Dawson, arrived on the scene, but they were intercepted by Mexican cavalry before they could join the main Texan force. 2 men managed to escape. The rest were killed or taken prisoner in what would become known as the Dawson Fight. 2 days after the fighting, Wool's army evacuated town and took with it a few dozen Anglo prisoners and as many as 200 Tejanos who feared reprisals if they remained. Hayes and Caldwell pursued the retreating Mexican army to the Hondo River, where they briefly attacked Wool's rear guard before breaking off the pursuit. End of quote. So yeah, Wallace finally got a chance to engage the very same army that had killed his brother and cousin. And in just the Battle of Salado Creek alone, they were able to kill over 60 of the Mexican soldiers, and send the rest packing. But be that as it may, I guess Wallace felt like he hadn't fully settled the account, as just 2 months later, he would sign on with the ill-fated Somerville expedition. And when I say ill-fated, it was a complete and total disaster. They left San Antone, several hundred strong under the leadership of Alex Somerville, looking to punish the Mexicans and hopefully get rich in the process. Unfortunately, they also failed to secure adequate provisions. They weren't properly equipped for the weather, they got lost on the way there, and morale plummeted. Nevertheless, they did make it to the border, and they did regain control of Laredo, at which point Somerville just went ahead and ordered his men to return home. According to Texas historian Joseph Nance, quote, "Little energy had been shown in prosecuting the campaign, which apparently was undertaken as a political move to appease demands for an invasion of Mexico and to reveal the futility of sustaining an attack upon Mexico without adequate supplies, equipment, and discipline. The Texans were so disappointed with the order to disband that only 189 men and officers obeyed. Some 308 men under 5 captains and commanded by William S. Fisher continued to Mexico on the Muir expedition," end quote. And yeah, the great William Bigfoot Wallace was right there with them. He was also among those who attacked the town of Muir on Christmas Day, 1842, an action that saw over 60 of his companions killed as he and the others were taken prisoner. Like I said, this entire expedition was doomed from the get-go. Why they thought they could take over Muir, even though they were outnumbered 10-1, is beyond me. But they did try, and like I said, although they fought bravely, Wallace and the survivors had no other choice but to surrender. Bigfoot would later express his emotions in a racially charged diatribe, saying that he'd never forget the humiliation at having to lay down his arms. Now, he and a few of his buddies would stage an escape, overpowering their guards and hightailing it to the desert, but they were all captured within a week. Not only that, but they were then sentenced to death by none other than Santa Anna himself. Luckily for Wallace, the Mexican officers had mercy on him, and rather than slaughter the entire bunch, they instead selected just 10 of the invading Texans for execution. I say they selected, but in all reality, it was more of a lottery. They placed a large number of white beans in a jar, along with 10 black beans, and each of the Texans were then forced to take turns reaching inside and drawing the bean. Those who were lucky enough to grab white ones were spared, but the unfortunate 10 who drew black beans were then placed against a wall and summarily executed via firing squad. If this sounds familiar and you didn't grow up in Texas like I did, you may be thinking of Larry McMurtry's Dead Man's Walk. Not only is Bigfoot Wallace featured in both the book and the film adaptation, but they also showed the bean incident. Only difference is, in McMurtry's version, Wallace is among the executed. In all reality, he was one of the lucky ones who managed to draw a white bean. He still wasn't completely off the hook, though. He and his compadres were then taken to Mexico City and forced to work on chain gangs, before being transferred again to the infamous Perote prison in September of 1843. And it's there where they stayed until their release nearly a year later. And my apologies if I got Perote prison wrong. Perote prison, Perote, I think it's Perote. Now, just to give you an idea how badly they were treated, Wallace would bear the scars from his shackles for the remainder of his life. In fact, in a letter to his father, he would admit that he had, quote, "undergone more than I had any idea human nature could bear," end of quote. Now, just as soon as Wallace got back to Texas, he joined up with the Texas Rangers under the able leadership of the aforementioned John Coffee Hayes. It's worth noting the Texas Rangers back in the 1840s were quite a bit different from the professionals of today. The men who Wallace served with were a mostly ragtag bunch of frontiersmen, nearly as wild, if not more wild, than their indigenous opponents. They fought hard, they drank hard, and in time, they would come to master the art of guerrilla warfare. Or to quote another Texas historian, T.R. Fehrenbach, they were one of the most colorful, efficient, and deadly band of irregular partisans on the side of law and order that the world has ever seen. And yeah, their main job, or at least when Wallace was riding with them, was to protect the settlers from the Comanches and their various allies. And it would be with the Rangers that Wallace would experience what he described as his toughest battle of them all. The fight in question occurred in the spring of 1846, after a Comanche war party struck the settlements near San Antone. Hayes and his Rangers, Wallace included, tracked the warriors for days before deciding to abandon the trail and try to get ahead of them. Apparently, either Hayes or his Tonkawa scout figured that the Comanche were heading to a well-known watering spot along the Concho River, a place known as Paint Rock, not too far from present-day San Angelo. Rangers arrived after dark, quickly set up an ambush, and sure enough, right at the ass crack of dawn, here comes the Comanches. At which point Wallace and the others unleashed an absolute hellstorm, with both men and horses dropping under their steady aim. Okay, fine, but the Comanche Nation ain't exactly known as being pushovers, right? They quickly rallied and began charging the outnumbered Rangers. Hostilities would die down that evening once the sun set, only to renew first thing the following morning. Once again, the Comanches charged the beleaguered Rangers, wave after wave. And although they never did manage to break through, it did seem to everyone involved that it was just a matter of time, especially considering that the Rangers were running low on powder and lead. That's when Captain Hayes drew a bead on one of the main chiefs and blew him plumb out the saddle. Sort of like what would occur at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls nearly 3 decades later. And I guess the Comanche figured that their medicine had gone bad. They called off the attack just like that and beat feet for the Llano. It weren't long after this that Wallace would head south of the border yet again, this time as Lieutenant and Captain Gillespie's Texas Mounted Volunteers, which, truth be told, was just another way of saying that they were Texas Rangers attached to the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War. I can't say for certainty how many skirmishes that Wallace would personally take part in, but he was there for the Battle of Monterey, a bloody affair that cost the lives of some 120 Americans and over twice as many Mexican soldiers. And due to their actions there in Monterey, as well as similar battles, the Mexicans soon took to calling Wallace and his fellow Rangers Los Diablos Tejanos, or for those of you who don't habla Espanol, the Texas Devils. And once the war was over, Wallace headed right back home and continued serving with the Rangers. In fact, by the 1850s, he had a company of his own. Wasn't just fighting Comanches and sassy bandits, though. You see, Wallace was so good at tracking that he'd also routinely be called upon to apprehend escaped slaves who were headed to their freedom in Mexico. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is history in a nutshell. You know, it can be very easy to want to look up to someone like Bigfoot Wallace, and I totally get it. He really was a larger-than-life character, a true frontiersman who proved his bravery time and time again. But he was also a massive hypocrite, and a bit of a bastard to boot. Keep in mind that Wallace knew exactly how it felt to be held in bondage. Not only had he himself been forced into slave labor down in Mexico, but his body still bore the scars from the shackles. And yet here he was just a few years later, denying freedom to his fellow man. And that's okay. Well, his actions aren't okay. It was a pretty shitty thing to do. What I mean is that it's okay to discuss his actions. You're not going to magically turn into a communist just by learning about verified historical events. I promise. You know, I've been doing this show for, over 6 years now. And the one thing that I've learned is that there are two very different prevailing models when it comes to how we view history. On one side, you got people, like I just mentioned, who only want to discuss the stuff that makes America, or America's so-called heroes, look flawless and beyond reproach. And if you ever veer off the path and say something that doesn't line up with their very narrow worldview, then you're accused of being a liberal revisionist. And on the other side, you've got the exact opposite. Political activists masquerading as historians. People who just use history as a way of trying to shame others or virtue signal. And you know the types. They can't discuss any historical events without, in the very same breath, mentioning how evil Americans are and how horrible we should feel about our past. It's my opinion that both of these groups are doing a great disservice, not only to history, but to people like me and you who have a genuine interest in history. Now, me personally, I like it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't think we have to suppress history just to further our own agendas, and we certainly don't have to water it down to make ourselves feel all warm and fuzzy on the inside. All these people that we discuss here on the Wild West Extravaganza, whether it's Bigfoot Wallace or Jesse James or Billy the Kid, they were all mere mortals. They made mistakes, they made bad choices, they wrestled with their own ethics or lack thereof. Sometimes they did really cool stuff, and sometimes they did things that I think most of us would consider reprehensible. And it's okay to talk about it. Contrary to popular belief, you can discuss history without also comparing every single historical figure to literally Hitler. And it's also possible to discuss the bad aspects of history, like Bigfoot Wallace chasing down runaway slaves. Doesn't mean that you're woke. At the end of the day, all we're doing is simply studying the lives of people who lived in the past, and hopefully learning from their mistakes. And unless you're willing to acknowledge the mistakes, we will end up repeating them. Us humans, throughout the course of history, up to and including our present timeline, haven't always been the best of neighbors to one another. And Bigfoot Wallace, colorful and brave as he may have been, was certainly no exception. Case in point, in early 1848, Wallace led a contingent of Rangers to attack an unsuspecting, and up until then, friendly, band of Lapon Apache. Lapon. I think that's how you pronounce it. Per Gary Anderson in The Conquest of Texas, quote, Ranger Bigfoot Wallace, who lived in the area at the time, described the troubles with the Lapon Apache as being directly related to settler occupations of the Medina River Valley. The Lapon Apache resisted and protested to the Rangers for 2 days, and then departed, vowing revenge. Small parties of Lapon Apaches returned and took a number of animals, although supposedly no one was killed. One of the mules driven off belonged to Bigfoot. Wallace waited until the Indians assumed they were safe in the spring of 1848, and then he gathered together 30 Rangers and stalked their new village. It was nestled in a rugged valley at the head of the Frio River, nearly on the edge of the Great Plains. End of quote. So yeah, apparently Wallace wasn't too happy about this mule being stolen, so they attacked a camp and killed several of the Apaches, as the rest of them scattered for the brush. According to John Duvall, who was not only present for the raid, but would later write Wallace's biography, Bigfoot, quote, could not help feeling some compunctions of conscience for the bloody awakening that was soon to rouse up my old friends and allies from their morning slumbers. But then, when I thought of the scurvy, rascally trick they had played on me, I dismissed all such ideas from my mind, and made my arrangements for an immediate attack upon the encampment. End quote. Now that little bit about the Lapon being his old friends and allies, that's on account of them joining up with the Texans during the Revolution with Mexico. They also scouted for the Rangers against the Comanches and Kiowas, and according to Wallace himself, he had even once lived with a Lapon. He personally knew these people. He had worked with them on multiple occasions, sat down and ate with them, and now here he was, ready to shed untold amounts of blood over a stolen mule. Now, believe it or not, Wallace would actually try and spare a young girl who had recognized him and clung to his shirt, begging for mercy. But sadly, she was still shot, allegedly by her own people, during the chaos of the battle. According to Wallace, he had tried his best. He even stated that in her final moments, she had begged him not to kill her father and mother, and that it caused him to regret attacking the village. Quote, the sort of life that I had led had not been one particularly to soften a feller's heart, but I am not ashamed to own, as I gazed upon the stiffening form of this forest child, so cruelly cut down by the hands of her own friends and relatives, that my eyes were dimmed with tears, and I sincerely wished on her account that I had permitted her tribe to go unpunished for breaking the treaty they had made with me. End of quote. He then changes his mind, saying that regrets are useless, and he and the Rangers continued killing. The superiority of our weapons, especially the revolvers, more than made up for our deficiency in numbers, and they at length gave way. Breaking into little squads, they fled in every direction before my men, who followed them in the same disorderly manner. All total, according to Wallace, they ended up killing 48 Lapon Apaches, only 21 of whom were warriors. Now, in addition to all that rangering and chasing down escaped slaves, Wallace also drove a mail coach between San Antonio and El Paso, a punishing 600-mile route through some of the most dangerous country that Texas had to offer. Bandits, Comanches, Apaches, and even the desert itself stood ready to kill a man the very moment he let his guard down. And at one point, it damn near put Wallace under. As it were, some natives just stole his mules, so he was left stranded hundreds of miles from the nearest town, and with no other choice but to continue on foot. Legend has it that he stumbled onto a homestead days later, half-starved and asking for food. From Hispanics, no less. You know that had to hurt his feelings. All they had available were eggs, so he downed a total of 27 before continuing on to El Paso for a proper meal. Now, when the Civil War broke out, Wallace, like many of the other Rangers, opted to remain in Texas and continue guarding the frontier from hostiles. And yeah, the Comanche and the Kiowa were still a very real threat during this period. I've spoken about this before, but during the early 1860s, the line of the frontier there in Texas was pushed back at least 100 miles, with some counties being almost completely depopulated. Most of the able-bodied men were back east fighting Yankees, so there wasn't a whole hell of a lot to stop the Comanche raids, other than men like Bigfoot Wallace. Of course, by that point, he was already well on his way to becoming a living legend, known as much for his enormous frame and booming laugh as he was for his prowess in battle. In time, Wallace would put down roots in a little community there in South Texas known as Bigfoot, about 40 or so miles southwest of San Antone. He never would marry or have children, but he also never seemed to lack for company in his old age. People would travel from far and wide just to hear him spin tales in the shade of his cabin, leaning back in an old rawhide bottom chair, pipe in hand, and a mischievous glint in his eye. Wallace wasn't all that big on letting the truth get in the way of a good story, but lack of veracity notwithstanding, the man was a gifted storyteller. He told of battles, prisons, and narrow escapes, never failing to keep his audience laughing or shaking their heads in disbelief. To many, he was the epitome of a Texas frontiersman, and to others, he was simply a reminder of how violent the West truly was. And yeah, Wallace would eventually pass away there in Bigfoot, Texas, on January 7th, 1899, at around 82 years of age. A short while later, his body was moved to the state cemetery, where he was laid to rest near Stephen F. Austin and other iconic figures from Texas history. Now, before you go, I do have a few other odds and ends to discuss, not the least of which is how Wallace earned the nickname Bigfoot. By the way, when it comes to someone like Bigfoot Wallace, it is not easy to separate fact from fiction. There's just so much folklore surrounding this guy that it can be very difficult to know where the truth ends and the fairy tales begin. As for his nickname, there are three main theories, none of which have been proven to any degree of certainty. One of the theories, according to Wallace's own friend and biographer, John Duvall, states that he earned the name after getting into a fight with a giant of a Waco Indian, who, as fate would have it, was named Bigfoot. Apparently, Wallace came out on top, so from that point on, people took to calling him by the same name as his vanquished foe. Another theory from historian Andrew Sawwell poses that in 1839, Wallace was accused of committing petty theft that was actually committed by a local Native American. They both wore moccasins, so in order to prove his innocence, Wallace placed his own moccasin foot into the much larger footprint of the real thief. And from that point on, the name stuck. And then finally, the theory that I think is probably the most likely, albeit not nearly as exciting, is that Wallace simply had large feet. Did you know that Bigfoot Wallace was possibly the inspiration for Conan the Barbarian? Turns out the guy who invented Conan, author Robert E. Howard, was a huge fan of Texas history, and there's even correspondence between him and H.P. Lovecraft discussing Wallace. According to Howard, Wallace was, quote, perhaps the greatest figure in Southwest legendary. Hundreds of tales, a regular myth cycle, have grown up around him. But his life needs no myths to ring with breathtaking adventure and heroism. End of quote, and there you have it. So you tell me, who was the real Bigfoot Wallace? Was he truly a courageous hero like Howard claimed? Was he a vile monster who spent his life persecuting those who had the misfortune to be indifferent, like the Mexicans and natives and escaped slaves? Or was he just somewhere in the middle, a man of his times who, well, certainly not lacking in the courage department, oftentimes made some very questionable choices? A man capable of extraordinary feats of bravery, but also at the same time, stomach-churning acts of barbarism. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, adios.